Great. So we have another episode today and as we deepen into this kind of theme of trauma and the recovery of trauma, today is all about compassion and how important compassion-focused therapy is, particularly when we're talking about trauma.
Yeah. And just to recap on our last session, our last podcast, Musing All the Things, health, relationship and trauma, is that, we went into quite some detail last week on what trauma is. And of course, we want to cover like some of the greatest areas that you can encourage healing through learning, because I firmly believe that learning and being empowered with knowledge does move you towards a more healing state. Yeah.
Definitely. And I think this is something we really share as practitioners and therapists, is the idea that healing is a learning journey, and the fact that getting ourselves into that state is really important. But compassion, we cannot learn if we're not compassionate.
Yeah.
And this is a fundamental switch that we have to make, because if we're in a negative space, we're beating ourselves up, we have lots of judgment, we cannot get into that kind of learning zone at all.
Which, asking the question of historical methodology and framework working with trauma, like just touch on that for us,
So I talked a little bit in the last episode about how, all of us that sort of go off to trauma training school in a way, and study all the different methodologies and ways that people should recover from trauma. As I said last time, that some of the methods were really quite hardcore. It was seen as the kind of badass part of therapy. It's like, brace yourself, we're going to charge through this, and we're going to meet that anger and anxiety and disgust and the awful stuff that you've been through head on, and we're going to relive it, and we're going to be fine at the end of this. So it's something that kind of people had to really brace themselves and relive to be able to kind of get better. And it was pretty cruel. I mean, for some people that have had really acute trauma, it would re-traumatize them. The therapy was almost more traumatizing than what had actually happened following that. So since then, many methods have kind of developed, which are gentler, more present and forward focused, looking at triggers, looking at what is happening in the present moment that still shows you have unresolved trauma. And a trigger is a tentacle from the past where something happened, and this aspect of what happened to you, you're not cool with it. You haven't actually got over that piece of it. And how that looks is you are triggered in the present moment. Yeah. So that movement has been really, really crucial. And one of the big fundamental movements in the entire profession has been towards where we come from as therapists, and what we first teach clients to be able to process their trauma, which is this incredibly important concept of being compassionate.
Yeah, and so if we look at what, firstly, what a traumatized person needs is that they need safety first, right? Because traumatized people are in this state of this, fright, flight, freeze response where the world is an unsafe place. So safety is the key aspect here. And within that safety, there's these core principles that we look at, including, the active listening for trauma support, the validation techniques, empowering communication, which for some traumatized people, communication can be really tricky because they might have had terrible childhoods, for example, where they were punished for communicating, trying to communicate their needs. So yeah, I think what I like about just weaving some Hakomi into that Hakomi principles work to the principles of working compassionately with traumatized individuals, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And the principles in Hakomi, just kind of part one is loving presence, coming from that real non-judgment, loving place. We're just in this calm and peaceful, whatever you're going to tell me is absolutely fine, place.
Yeah.
Next one being kind of mindfulness.
And it's not mindfulness as in the buzzword of mindfulness, sitting there meditating. It's mindfulness where we ask and invite, because everything we invite in Hakomi, of course, is non-violent. We never assume that that's what the other wants to do. But we're inviting that mindfulness and curiosity by having the self, the observer, come forward so they can see what's happening. And that's part of that reflecting and education and being able to look at self in the organization that has happened as a result of trauma. So, we look at the loving presence, that's that active listening, like I hear you, you've got my undivided attention, I'm walking alongside you, I really get what's going on for you. And that's that kind of unity and organicity in the Hakomi principles as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think, unity and organicity is the idea that we trust that the person, genuinely, even though they're struggling, they might be struggling to heal and recover, like they're here, they're showing up, they want that, and trusting the way that the healing is going to happen is the way it needs to happen. So we're non-violent in the principles as well. It's not forcing or pushing or telling. There does need to be some directing and leading, but a lot of following as well, because it's this dance between, therapist and client to be able to co-create the kind of outcome.
And because it's a somatic psychotherapy as well, we're contacting and tracking facial movements, tiny miniature micro muscle movements in the face or the eyes, the fingers, we're looking at the whole body, because trauma is an embodied experience, and it's not what we think of it, it's what's happened to us inside, isn't it?
And that's an important piece, is that like when we talk about mindfulness is a really important cornerstone of compassion. It's about being just fully in our own selves and our own bodies to enable and train the client to actually re-embody themselves as well. Because a lot of people that have experienced trauma are disembodied. They've dissociated. It's not safe to return to the body.
Yes.
And by being calm and present and able to just be there, that safety first is kind of where we begin. And I think that having that stabilization and safety is important, because really good clinical supervisor of mine, Dr. Paris Williams, he always talked about, if you on a recovery journey, it's like hiking to Mount Everest. And that safety stabilization kind of area is the space where we're at base camp. And we have to stay at base camp and really acclimatize there before we move on to the next stage where we actually process anything. And that is where the compassion lives, and that setting the right context and tone for the way that the therapy is going to progress.
Yeah. And that's where, that kind of empowering communication part, which is one of the principles of compassion focused therapy, is that really focused on that non-violent component of Hakomi, where we're always asking before we make any suggestions, because it's not our place as therapists to interpret what's happened for that traumatized individual, but it is our responsibility to invite curiosity and mindfulness around it in a loving, present, organic, united way. Yeah. Because a lot of trauma, there's a lot of shame and guilt that is there. So I'd love you to talk to that.
Yeah. So we have, if you think of kind of two sort of branches of emotions that we have following experience of a trauma. I mean, there's a vast array of emotions, but there's kind of these two very polarized things that start to arise. The one are the kind of threat focused types of emotions: anger, anxiety, disgust, guilt, and shame. Guilt and shame are kind of, I'll take as a sidebar in a moment, but this threat focused set of emotions. Then you've got this incentive focused set of emotions like excitement, peace, contentment, love, affection. Now, we can end up shaming this set of emotions. It's not okay to feel like this. I need to feel like this. So our perfectionists, which we kind of covered a little bit on that when we were talking deeper about stress, The perfectionists put a lot of pressure on themselves, and a lot of high-powered clients that I've had, CEOs and bankers, so much pressure to be, I need to be excited and at peace, and so they're shaming that they're not okay.
Yeah.
And the core of everything is it's okay to not be okay. And if you don't come to that starting position, you cannot actually learn and heal. So with guilt and shame, Dr. Brene Brown has obviously done quite a lot of research, but so have a lot of other, important leaders in the field. The fundamental difference between guilt and shame is guilt is behavioral focus. So it's like I did something bad, or I did something that I'm not happy with, where shame actually embodies that. It's actually not I did something bad, I am bad.
Yeah, right.
I've actually taken that and really embodied it. And a researcher called Nathanson in 1992 did a wheel called the compass of shame, which is really interesting. And it looks at, well, when we're feeling shame, how is it manifesting in our lives? And for some people, they could attack the self, put themselves down, or have really kind of hardcore masochistic behaviors, like I shouldn't be feeling like this, I should be feeling like that. They can avoid and run away. And I see that a lot with a lot of professionals that I work with. They become complete workaholics when they've experienced trauma, denial, and they abuse drugs and alcohol, and they distract themselves through thrill seeking or through lots of hard work. So that attacking of self and the avoidance is really key. And then the other components of the wheel of shame is you withdraw, you isolate yourself, you don't want to be around people, you run or hide from the issue. And then the worst is if all else fails, then you attack others. You like torch the bridge, turn the tables, blame whoever, lash out verbally and physically. And the problem with this compass and this wheel is it's all things that we then become, I am bad at the core of it. Right. So this is why at base camp, before we can even start the therapy, you have to have this huge stabilization field, this cocooning, where we are in essence scaffolding in a whole set of skills and resources to be able to meet that place with loving presence and compassion.
And that's where we would be looking at like core beliefs and core organizations, which we're going to touch on next week. But and you'd be looking like what's their attachment style? Are they, have they had a secure base, an insecure base, avoidant, anxious? So you'd be collecting all of this data to see where their core organization actually is as well, right? Because that would also impact how they have managed the trauma is based on their attachment style, which was part of the organization when they were going through those, critical developmental years.
Yeah. And I mean, the core is when you're looking at resourcing, and we will, in one of our future episodes, we're going to talk just about what happens at base camp and what are all the things you can do to resource yourself following a trauma. That's a whole episode on its own, but it's kind of crucial to think about it from the perspective that if you don't proactively resource yourself, your brain and body will just go and find survival resources no matter what. And those survival resources that it picks are not chosen. They kind of choose you. And that's where we become workaholics. We become chronic people pleasers. We start kind of ballistically exercising or ballistically shopping or getting angry or, and the compass of shame can really feature there. It's because we're just trying to get to safety. We're just trying to survive.
Yeah, so that's when the addictions can come in, right? Whether it's addicted to work, addicted to shopping, addicted to drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling, like the list goes on. And then what happens is that person then can identify as being an addict, but actually they're not an addict. That's just a secondary cause of the core organization and the resources or the lack of that they had growing up during those critical developmental years. So reflecting and learning is key when you're working in the framework of compassion with trauma.
Definitely. And I think the crucial thing is you cannot learn if you're in a shame spiral. You cannot learn if you're beating yourself up. You cannot learn if you're running a hindsight bias or a should cognitive distortion. And these are basically things where we have a lot of critical self-reflection on, I should have done this, I could have done that, why didn't I do? And it's really cruel kind of to think of ourselves in that way, because we have to, from a compassionate place, understand that in every given moment, we're only ever doing the best that we can at the time with the information and all the resources we had at that time. That is a really important assumption for how we as human beings operate. So when we're judging and criticizing and being hardcore, we cannot learn. You cannot be curious. You cannot go, that's really interesting. So even my survival resource that I'm using right now, where I'm running around shouting and screaming at everyone, that actually meets this need. I didn't realize it met that need. Well, maybe there's a different strategy for how to meet that need without using this particular resource that I've just resorted to.
That's right. So it's like being reactive in a sympathetic dominant state, right? Versus being responsive in a parasympathetic dominant state. So
that's right.
We touched on that on our stress parts in podcast. But so I guess some of the things that we need to look at as well is like, how do we support the therapist during this process? Because self-care strategies have to be put in place for the supporter, right? So there needs to be
definitely. And I think we're going to have an entire episode talking about all the resourcing techniques that you as a client need to install at base camp before you go on your journey to climb Everest.
Yes.
But these points that you raise about how important it is to support the therapist is key, because we hold the context of the therapy, and the context dictates the content of how it's going to move. And if we're not okay, we cannot make it okay for somebody else. We cannot, listen to them with standing in the principles or installing compassion for anybody. And therapeutic burnout is a major problem, and ever since COVID, it is tenfold. I mean, I have so many clients that are therapists that have completely and utterly they've burned out. They haven't tended to their own kind of self-care. And just talk a little bit about what are some of the things that people can really, if you're a therapist or you're a carer, how can you look after yourself a bit better so that you're not literally the wounded healer?
Yeah, well, that's right. So I think some of the key critical things would be, just having your own emotional boundaries, like maintaining clear professional, personal boundaries, knowing when to refer to additional resources, knowing when to refer when you feel like you're outside of your scope of practice. Like that's key, isn't it? Regular practice of self-care is another one. So engaging in physical self-care, making sure you're sleeping, you've got good nutrition, you're exercising. Who are your support people? Scheduling regular breaks in between clients for processing to occur, and replenishing your emotional needs by making sure that you've got emotional reserves, essentially. And how do you replenish those? And I think professional support is really critical in that, where you've got a good supervisor, you can touch on things that have moved you emotionally, because some individuals with emotional trauma, like it moves you that they have had such suffering and how they still manage to carry on. Like, I feel moved even saying that out loud, because I have had some clients and I go, I don't know how you manage to get out of bed in the morning with what's the trauma that they have incurred. And, often a traumatized individual can go on to be re-traumatized or traumatized again with another event. And so being mindful of that as the therapist as well, like recognizing you might be experiencing secondary trauma in yourself. So, vicarious traumatization, for example, tracking your capacity for empathy and connection, and taking action when you notice that you've got compassion fatigue. So those are some of the key things. I'm sure you can add in a whole lot more.
Yeah, I think the key thing is to get that if you are the person that is literally piloting someone out of the place that they're in, you need to be in a place where you're able to do that. And you've got to kind of not BS yourself. You got to tell the truth to yourself. Am I actually in a good space to be able to lead?
Yep.
Because being a trauma therapist is being a leader and a follower at the same time. But there are moments when you really need to understand and read the room and track and notice where your clients are at to see, are they moving out of their window of tolerance? Like, and you got to track your own self and your own body. Am I moving out of my window of tolerance? So it's deep, deep awareness, incredible levels of self-awareness, incredible levels of working on yourself. Like if you're a trauma therapist and you don't have your own therapy, you don't have clinical supervision, that is a really, really dangerous place to be in. So, you know, and that's where compassion fatigue and burnout and things can happen, is often because they've let something slip. I mean, I'm boring. I live my life with absolute precision, like clockwork. There are things that I do every single day, every single week. I eat pretty much the same stuff all the time. And I have this insane routine. I mean, my husband is always teasing me about it, but it's like the routine is really crucial, because it's like being an athlete. You have to put yourself in a particular place so that you have to be good with yourself. And I keep it's going to sound ridiculous, but I keep an integrity journal. I keep a journal for myself where I'm constantly measuring, are there things in my life that are in or out of integrity? And if there are, and it's not like you're trying to have everything in all the time, because it's either out or it's on its way out. But integrity defined as the state of being whole and complete. And where are things slightly incomplete for me? Where are things a little bit whatever? Okay, I need to sort that out. I need to converse with that person. I forgot to do that. Let me go sort that out. So all these incompletions, they lead us to feel like a leakage.
Yes.
And when you have that leakage and you don't feel powerful in yourself, you lose that ability to lead and be powerful when you're being confronted with something in therapy.
Which is why it's equally as important for us to be in our own therapy. So we have supervision. We are responsible for that. We are responsible for self-care strategies as the supporter, as the carer, as the leader, as the follower. But then there's the other part of ourself as well, where we have to be in our own therapy, which is a very safe thing to do.
Yeah, for sure. And the same principles that we're talking about in terms of kind of care for the helper, right, applies also when you've had experienced some kind of trauma that you're recovering from. You got to treat yourself like a patient and an athlete at the same time.
Yes.
This is not the time to have big blowouts and shave your head and, you know, run around and, you know, sleep with all the people and shop all the things. You know, if you notice yourself starting to do that, it's like, wow, this is actually time to get grounded. This is time to kind of slow things down and calm things down, so that I treat myself like a patient that is going into recovery. And I'm a little bit kicking my own butt and going, I'm also needing to look after myself and get good nutrition and all that stuff. And if you struggle with compassion with yourself, there's some key things you can do. So we're going to cover it in a lot more depth when we talk about resourcing at the base camp. But, you know, breathing is such a silly thing. Like, why is breathing important? Breathing is one of the core principles of becoming mindful, is actually focusing on how are we breathing, because our breathing can affect whether we're in sympathetic nervous state or parasympathetic nervous state. So having some breathing exercises, okay, and we'll cover those a lot more at base camp, but creating like a safe space for yourself, somewhere where you can retreat and be in still and quiet. You know you're not in a good space if you cannot handle still and quiet. Okay.
Right.
If you cannot sit down for 10 minutes and have a cup of tea without checking your phone and doing multiple things at the same time, it's a sign of how triggered you are. It's a sign of how dysregulated you are. So forcing yourself, beginning just 2 minutes, okay, then increase the timer, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. What it does, it starts to build a muscle of, I can tolerate space. Because if you don't have space, you can't develop compassion anyway.
Yeah.
Then compassionate letter writing is a really good technique as well, is writing letters to yourself for the person that was there.
Yeah.
like, hey, I can, and actually forcing yourself to look at, well, what was going on for that person at the time?
Yeah.
That person at that time, what was the information they had at that time? Not what do I think as the adult today, what they should have done or could have done.
Yeah.
Who was that person back there? That young woman, that young man? Where were they at? What did they believe? What did they think? And it's kind of through this narrative sort of letter writing experience is to reflect and see and force yourself to notice, actually, I'm being overly harsh, overly kind of in that bad place. So the other thing is to also formulate something called a compassionate image. So what would compassion look like for you? And, what would that image kind of be? And how can I practice being kinder to myself, warmer to myself?
Yeah.
If my best friend went through the same thing, how would I be with them? I'd run them a hot bath and go, just you take a load off, dude.
And we're our worst, worst critics, aren't we? Self-critics. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there's some really nice tips there. There's 3 tips to take away with, isn't there? Like the resource of the breath, the resource of writing, and the resource of like image of what compassion can be. Yeah.
But as I said, we'll go into it in a lot more depth when we cover resourcing. It's one of the most important fundamentals you can do for yourself. And everyone that has gone through anything tough, if you really build that muscle of resourcing and you treat yourself as an athlete and the patient at the same time, develop routines, healing is a foregone conclusion.
Yeah. So there's this element of discipline that is required, isn't there? There's a motivation that's required to move forward towards healing, isn't there?
Yeah. Very much.
Well, that was great, Dilly. Thank you so much. And next week will be core beliefs and core organisation. So thanks for joining us, musing all the things health, relationship and trauma.
Wonderful. Till next time.
Bye.
The information shared on the Naked Insights podcast is for educational and information purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional therapy or counselling. While we aim to provide helpful and accurate insights, individual experiences may vary. If you're experiencing trauma, mental health issues, or distress, please seek guidance from a qualified professional. The views expressed by us as the hosts are our own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of any affiliated organizations.